Hi there! In this next set of videos we're going to start to look at repetition. Firstly we're going to take a look at loops and three of the loop structures that are available to us in Java for repetition. We're going to look at the control flow of those loops and how they work or how they differ. Then we're going to take a look at counter-controlled loops specifically, and we're going to look at the different components that each counter-controlled loop requires. We're going to then take a look at nested loops, and that's when we put one loop inside of another. And then finally we'll take a look at some sentinel controlled loops and how they differ then from the workflow of a counter controlled loop. Okay, so what is a loop? A loop is a structure that allows repeated execution of a block of statements. So that can be made up of one or more statements. So if we have a particular part of our program that we'd like to repeat without having to actually put those lines of code in over and over again, we use a loop. A counter-controlled loop then more specifically uses a variable to count how many times that block of statements is repeated. So if we're going to repeat a number of lines of code, how many times do we want to do it? And it's going to count each of those times to make sure it runs the correct number of times. All counter-controlled loops require four key elements. So we're going to take a look at those now. The first element that's necessary for a counter-controlled loop is initialization. So what we're doing here is we're taking a variable, just a standard variable, an integer variable, and we're going to use it to count how many times the piece of code is executed. And so the first component here, initialization, is just initializing that variable to tell it where to start. So what value does our counter start at? 9 times out of 10 will start at 0, but on occasion, depending on what the problem is, you might want to start at a different number. The next component that's essential then is the termination, or what value the counter stops at. So if we want something to be repeated 4 times, and we are starting our counter at 0, we're going to want to stop once the counter gets to 4. Progression then is how do we get our counter to move from 0 all the way to 4. So how does the counter get from the starting value to the stopping value? And then the action of the loop is what block of statements we want to repeat. So which lines of code exactly do we want to use over and over and over again? I think the best way to understand these is to look at them in relation to some code or in relation to the actual structures of the loops. So let's take a look at that. A for loop is the first type of loop we're going to take a look at. And it's important to emphasize at this point that all three of the different types of loops that we're going to look at today can be used interchangeably. They all do the same job with the exception of one tiny rule which we'll look at a little bit later. But for the most part they're interchangeable and you can use whichever one you have a preference for. The first one we're going to take a look at is a for loop. A for loop structure is this. We use our keyword for, so you'll note the lowercase f there for for. Then we open a round bracket. Inside that then we're going to have each of our 4 components that we need in our loop. The first is initialization. Then we have our termination. So our initialization is where does the counter start. Termination is where does the counter end. Progression then is how do we get from the starting point to the end. Then we close our round bracket, open our curly bracket, and then finally inside we have what we call our action, which is what does the loop actually need to repeat? What are the lines of code or line of code that we're going to want to repeat in here? So let's take a look at that with an actual example. Supposing we wanted to print I love Java 10 times. Now we know we could just do system.out.println I love Java, system.out.println I love Java, and we could just put that line of code in there 10 times, which is fine for 10, but if we were doing 100 it might be a little bit difficult. So let's take a look at how we might use a loop for that. Here's our for loop. So you'll see we have our keyword for, we open our round bracket, then we have int I equals 0. So here we're just declaring a variable called I and we're initializing it to 0. And then we have our semicolon. So it's one instruction to Java. Declare a variable that will hold an integer, name the variable I and assign the value 0. And that is our initialization. Okay? You might be wondering why I And I stands for iterator. Okay, so it's counting each iteration of the loop, each time we go around. Really, we could use any word or letter that we want here. We tend to stick to a letter because it keeps it shorter. We could say count, we could say counter, we could have X, we could have banana. It really doesn't matter so long as we're consistent. But the standard that you'll see in a lot of the examples you take a look at is I. And if I's already been taken for something else, we'll move on and we'll use J because that's next in the alphabet. So our next step then is I less than 10. So you'll see we have I less than 10, semicolon. This is our termination. And this is saying continue to repeat the code so long as I is less than 10. So that's our termination phase of the loop. The last piece then here in the top line is I equal to I plus 1. So what we're saying here is take the value that's in I, add 1 to it, and store the new value in I. So if, for instance, I have a 0 in I, I'm going to increase that value by 1, so it becomes 1, and I store that back in I. So I'm just increasing the value that's stored in I. And this is how I'm going to get from my 0 to my 10. So that's my progression. And then finally, my action for the loop is system.out.println I love Java. So the thing that I want to repeat over and over and over again is my action. And they're my 4 components. That's the for loop. The next loop we're going to take a look at is a while loop. Again, it has all the same 4 components. It works in much the same way. But this time, the structure is a little bit different. Just to look at. So what we have first off is our initialization. So that's our first component. Then we have the keyword while. We open a round bracket, and inside the round brackets then we have our termination, which is our second component. We open a curly bracket then, and inside the so we have an open and closed curly bracket, and between those then we have our action and our progression. So our progression is our third component, which is how we get from our initialization to our termination. And then our action is our fourth component. But you'll see here actually the action is performed before the progression. And we'll see that a little bit later when we look at the actual flow of the loops. So let's take a look at the same example. Suppose we want to print I love Java 10 times. How are we going to do this? So our code looks like this. Again, our initialization, our first step is int I equals 0. So create an integer variable I that has the value 0 in it. And that's our initialization. Then we have our keyword while. Notice again, lowercase w. Open our round brackets. And inside that we have our I less than 10. So continue so long as I is less than 10. And when it's not, terminate. And that's our termination. Inside that then we have our, you'll see our I equals I plus 1 here. That's our progression. How do we get from 0 to 10? And then finally we have our system.out.println I love Java, and that's our action. So the very same components, just jumbled about a little bit differently on the screen. Our do while loop then is the third structure we're going to take a look at today. You'll see again it looks similar to the while loop in that our initialization is up here on its own by itself, the first thing here, and that's our initialization. Then we have the keyword do. Again, watch out, lowercase d. We open a curly bracket, and then inside we have our action progression, and at the bottom then we have the keyword while and we have our termination. So your second component is at the very bottom. Okay, it's the very last thing we take a look at. Then we have our progression in the middle and our action also. Looking then at the same example, I love Java. You'll see we have our int I equals 0 is our initialization. Down the bottom we have our I less than 10, which is our termination. Inside then we have our I equals I plus 1, which is our progression. And finally we have our system.out.println, which is our action. And those are the 4 different loop types. The components are the 3 different loop types and the 4 different components that each one of them needs. Just slightly different for each example because the components are the same, but the structure is just a tiny little bit different for each one. Okay, so in order to better understand what's going on here, we're going to take a look at the loop flow. And we'll just look at it in terms of one particular structure. So we'll take a look at the for loop structure. And again, we'll try this printing I love Java, but we'll just do it 5 times for the purpose of this example. So there you have your loop structure for int I equals 0, I less than 5, I equals I plus 1, and then system.out.println I love Java. So when we say int I equals 0, what's happening there is we're creating a variable, we're labeling it as I, and we're initializing that value to 0. The next thing that the code does is it checks, is the value of I less than 5? In this instance, 0 is less than 5, so it performs the action, I love Java, and it prints I love Java to the command window. Then we go to the I equals I plus 1, and what that does is it increases the value of I to 1. Then we go back to our termination and we check, is I less than 5? And 1 is less than 5. So we perform our action, system.out.println I love Java. We go back then to our progression, I equals I plus 1, which increases I. Now I now becomes 2. We check our termination, is I less than 5? Yes it is. So we perform our action, print I love Java. We increase the value of I by 1 again, I equals I plus 1, I becomes 3. We check the termination to see if 3 is less than 5, and it is. So we print I love Java. We increase the value of I again by 1, so I becomes 4. And then we check to see is 4 less than 5, which it is. So we print I love Java. We increase the value of I by 1, I equals I plus 1. And we get to 5. We check to see, is that less than 5? No, it's not. 5 is not less than 5, so we don't perform the action. We exit the loop and we move on with whatever other code might be part of this particular application. In this example, we have now printed I love Java 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, which was the purpose of the exercise, and we exit the loop. So the role of the variable I in a counter-controlled loop can be seen here in this example, and it's similar for that of a while or a do-while loop. The next step, I think, in understanding these loops is to look at them in terms of a coded example. So that's what we'll look at next.